Okay, so we're looking at the last slide from yesterday. So she wrote a lot of poems about different subjects, but like we talked about how she liked to focus on introspection, looking at herself, and interior life rather than what was happening in the outside world. So a lot of her poems talk about personal identity, psychology, emotional pain, pleasure, love, divine, and death. The theme of death is pretty constant throughout hers, so we're going to look at that one in particular. And so here is kind of what we're looking at. Walt Whitman suggests that death, the human body and soul, merge with nature and eternity to become mortal. However, Dickinson views a little bit different. She views death less cosmically and more personally. So Whitman thought that, when you die, your body and your soul become one with nature, and that's how you become immortal. She saw it in a different way. And so there's two different poems specifically mentioning death, and so we're going to look at them. Boop, boop, boop. There it is. So the first one was, I heard a fly buzz when I died. A stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable, and then it was there I interposed a fly. With blue, uncertain shambling buzz between the light and me, when the windows failed, and then I could not see. So that's the first one. And then the next one was, because I could not stop for death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew, quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet, my only tool. Sorry, I'm trying to get it to go. Only tool. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling on the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Okay, so those were the two poems. I'm trying to get back. There we go. And so we're looking at, what does she talk about death, her views on death. I'm going to make my notes big so you can see them here. For her, in the poems, the speaker's death is something that they are confronting. And so, she doesn't soften it. She doesn't make it seem magical or anything like that. She doesn't generalize it. She doesn't try to make you feel better about the fact that death is happening. She just states, death is a fact of life, and that it's going to happen. And she's leaving you to deal with your own emotions of death, because she believed in introspection. She liked to think about those things and think about how her emotions felt as she thought about those morbid thoughts. And so I heard a fly buzz when I died. The speaker in the poem is actually someone who is already dead and reflecting upon the moment of their death. Instead of the arrival of the king, the mourners are greeted by a fly. When it buzzes into the room, the entire tone of the experience changes. So, going back to it, so we were looking for heard a fly buzz. Looking right here, so they were waiting for the king, and then instead of a king, it was a fly that came in and interrupted. And then it was stumbling around between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then they couldn't see, right? So they're showing that while she's sitting there waiting for the king to arrive, because it felt like such a huge occasion to her or the speaker, it was in fact a perfectly ordinary everyday thing that happened. And so the reader sees that it's ordinary every day because a fly flies in. If it was a magical, special, important moment, you don't typically think about the flies coming in the room and things like that, right? You think about just the big things that are happening, like a king entering a room. And then in this one, for Because I Could Not Stop for Death, you see her talking about death as a carriage driver. So this one's more upfront. He's driving the carriage towards immortality. So he's just driving the carriage, stopping along, picking up people as they die. Doesn't have a rush or anything like that. Sees death as just something that's happening. You pass everybody by who's still living. And then, you're talking about how it's starting to get cold. She only has a gown on. Gossamer's a thin gown. And then they pause before a house that seemed to be swelling on the ground. So the roof is barely visible. And so basically she's talking about a coffin, right? So it's a swelling in the ground. The roof is scarcely visible. So it's talking kind of about a coffin there coming to her resting place. And then since then to centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. So talking about the passing of time and how it seems very short to her, but it's been centuries. And the horses' heads are turned towards eternity. So she sees death as something that is everyday and you have to confront it. And so she was showing it in two different ways. But she frequently talks about death as a carriage driver, and it stops to pick people up and takes them on to eternity.